Let's start with something most people misunderstand. Detachment is not about pretending you don't care. It's about no longer losing yourself in the process of caring. Because when you're emotionally attached in an unbalanced way, it shows. It shows in how quickly you respond, how much you overthink, how often you check, how deeply you react to every small change. And without realizing it, that energy becomes heavy. Not because caring is wrong, but because it's no longer grounded. It's dependent. When you're constantly available, constantly reacting, constantly trying to maintain the connection, there's no space left for the other person to feel your absence. There's no contrast. You become predictable in a way that removes any sense of value from your presence. Not because you're not valuable, but because what is always there without effort often becomes overlooked. Detachment changes that dynamic. The moment you stop chasing, stop trying to control outcomes, stop needing constant reassurance, something shifts just in how they see you, but in how you carry yourself. You become calmer, more centered, less reactive. You're no longer moving based on their actions. You're moving based on your own stability. And that kind of energy is different. It's not loud, but it's noticeable. Because people are naturally drawn to what they don't fully have access to. Not in a game-playing way, but in a psychological sense. When something feels uncertain, when it's not guaranteed, it creates curiosity. It creates attention. It makes them wonder what changed. And that question only comes up when there is a shift in your behavior. But here's the key. Real detachment is not a tactic. It's a mindset. If you're pulling back just to get a reaction, it won't last. Because the moment you don't get the response you expected, you'll go right back to chasing. True detachment means you've accepted that you don't need to control the outcome. Whether they come closer or drift further away, your focus remains on your own balance. And that's where your power comes from. Because when you're no longer emotionally dependent on how someone responds to you, you stop giving away control. You stop reacting out of fear of losing them. You stop over-investing in moments that don't match your standards. And instead, you start observing, choosing, deciding. And ironically, that's when your presence becomes more impactful. Because now your attention is not automatic. It's intentional. Your energy is not constant, it's earned. And your responses are not driven by emotion. They're guided by awareness. Detachment doesn't push people away. It reveals who is willing to come closer without being pulled. And the moment you truly detach is the moment your presence starts carrying real value. Now, once that shift begins, the next thing that matters is this. Your absence has to actually feel like something. Because if nothing changes when you step back, then nothing will change in the dynamic. If your energy, your attention, your availability all remain the same, just slightly quieter, then there's no contrast. And without contrast, there's no realization. Most people think pulling away means just replying slower or being a little less expressive. But if internally you're still focused on him, still waiting, still checking, still emotionally invested in the same way, then your absence isn't real. It's just delayed presence. And that doesn't create impact. That doesn't shift anything. It only keeps you in the same pattern, just with more frustration. For your absence to feel different, your energy has to genuinely move. That means your attention is no longer centered around what he's doing, what he's thinking, or whether he's going to reach out. It means your time starts filling up with your own life again, your priorities, your growth, your peace. And when that happens, your presence naturally becomes less predictable, less available, and more intentional. Because when someone is used to having consistent access to you, your messages, your attention, your emotional availability, and that access changes, it creates awareness. Not because you're trying to manipulate anything, but because something real has shifted. They no longer feel you in the same way, at the same intensity, at the same consistency. And that absence creates space. Space for them to notice the difference. Space for them to reflect on what they had versus what they're experiencing now. Space for them to feel the gap that your constant presence used to fill. But that only happens if the absence is genuine. If you're still showing up in small ways, still making sure they feel you, still trying to maintain a connection from a distance, then you're closing that space before it has a chance to do anything. You're removing the very contrast that would have created a shift. Real absence is not about disappearing. It's about redirecting. It's about taking the energy you were giving outward and bringing it back to yourself. It's about becoming less available, not out of strategy, but out of alignment. Because you're no longer willing to give the same level of access without the same level of consistency in return. And when that happens, something changes in how you're perceived. Because now your presence is not something that's always there. It's something that's felt when it's gone. And that feeling creates a different kind of attention. Not forced, not chased, but realized. Because people don't always appreciate what they have while it's constant, but they notice it when it's no longer guaranteed. And the moment your absence feels different is the moment your presence starts being valued differently. And this is where most people think they need to say more, explain more, prove more. But the truth is, the strongest message you can send is not in your words, it's in your standards. Because self-respect doesn't need long explanations. It doesn't need to convince anyone of anything. It shows itself in what you allow, what you accept, and what you quietly walk away from. When someone has experienced you always being available, always being understanding, always making space for their inconsistency, they start to expect that version of you. Not out of intention, but out of repetition. And expectations are shaped by patterns. So if your pattern has always been to explain yourself, to express your feelings in long messages, to justify why something bothered you, then that becomes the language of the connection. But when you shift into self-respect, the language changes. You're no longer explaining why something didn't feel right. You're simply not engaging with it. You're no longer asking for clarity. You're observing whether it's there. You're no longer trying to be understood. You're deciding what aligns with you and what doesn't. And that kind of shift is powerful because it removes the need for negotiation. Because the truth is, people don't always change because of what you say. They change because of what they experience. They notice when access feels different. They notice when your energy is no longer automatic. They notice when the same behavior no longer gets the same response. That's self-respect in action. It's not about being distant or cold. It's about being clear. Clear in your standards, clear in your boundaries, clear in your energy. And clarity doesn't need volume. It doesn't need repetition. It just needs consistencies. Because when your actions consistently reflect that you won't accept inconsistency, disrespect, or confusion, it creates a new dynamic. One where the other person has to either meet that standard or lose access to you entirely. And that decision doesn't come from what you told them. It comes from what you showed them. This is why trying to explain your worth rarely works. Because worth is not something you describe. It's something you demonstrate through how you treat yourself. If you tolerate behavior that doesn't match your value, your words lose meaning. But when your actions align with your standards, your presence carries a different weight. And that weight is felt even in silence because now your energy is not trying to hold the connection together. It's allowing the connection to prove itself. You're no longer adjusting to keep someone. You're standing firm in who you are and letting them decide if they can meet you there. And that's where real respect begins. Not from what you say, but from what you consistently show. And the moment your actions start reflecting your self-respect is the moment everything about how you're treated begins to change. Now here's where everything either holds its power or falls apart. Consistency in your standards. Because it's one thing to pull back once, to act differently for a moment, to decide you won't tolerate something just this time. But if that shift isn't consistent, it doesn't become your identity. It becomes a phase. And phases don't change dynamics. They only pause them. People don't adjust to what you say once they adjust to what you repeat. If one day you set a boundary and the next day you ignore it, the message becomes unclear. Not just to them, but to yourself. You start second-guessing your own standards. You start wondering if maybe you were too strict, too distant, too firm. And that internal doubt is exactly what pulls you back into old patterns, because inconsistency in your standards creates permission. It tells the other person, without saying a word, that the limits you set are flexible. That if they wait long enough, say the right thing, or show just enough effort, things will go back to how they were. And when that happens, nothing really changes. The same behavior continues, just with temporary interruptions. But when your standards are consistent, something different happens. There's no testing. There's no guessing. The line you set stays where it is, regardless of mood, emotion, or circumstance. And that kind of consistency creates clarity, not just for them, but for you. You don't have to keep deciding what's acceptable because you've already decided. And that's where your strength builds, because now your behavior is not reactive. It's aligned. You're not responding based on how you feel in the moment. You're responding based on what you've already established as your standard. And that removes the emotional back and forth that keeps most people stuck. It also creates a natural filter. The right people adjust to your standards because they respect them. The wrong people fall away because they can't meet them. And instead of trying to figure out who someone is through words or promises, you start seeing it clearly through how they respond to your consistency. And this is what makes your presence powerful. Not because you're doing something dramatic, but because you're doing something steady. You're no longer changing based on external behavior. You're staying grounded in your own values. And that stability becomes something others can feel. Because when someone realizes that your standards are not temporary, that your boundaries are not negotiable, that your energy is not easily accessible, it forces a decision. Either they rise to meet you or they lose access to you. And that decision doesn't come from pressure. It comes from clarity. Because you're no longer trying to make something work. You're allowing it to prove itself. And the moment your standards become consistent is the moment your value becomes undeniable. And this is where the energy shifts in a way you don't have to force, when your life becomes bigger than the connection itself. Because mystery isn't something you try to create through silence or distance. It's something that naturally exists when your focus is no longer centered on one person. When your world is full, your time is meaningful, and your attention is directed toward your own growth, something changes in how you show up. You're no longer waiting for messages, no longer checking for responses, no longer structuring your day around someone else's presence. Your energy starts flowing into your own priorities, your goals, your work, your passions, your peace. And when that happens, your availability becomes limited in a natural way. Not because you're trying to be unavailable, but because you genuinely have more going on. That's what creates intrigue. Because when someone is used to having easy, predictable access to you, and suddenly your energy is not always there, not always immediate, not always centered around them, it stands out. They start to notice that you're no longer as accessible, not as reactive, not as focused on maintaining the connection. And that difference raises questions. But here's the key. It only works when it's real. If you're pretending to be busy while still internally focused on them, it doesn't carry the same energy. It feels forced, and eventually it breaks. Real mystery comes from alignment, from genuinely being engaged in your own life. It's not about hiding what you're doing. It's about not needing to constantly share or explain it. Because when you're fulfilled on your own, you stop seeking validation from someone else. You stop needing constant reassurance, constant attention, constant confirmation that you matter. And that independence changes everything. It shifts you from someone who is waiting to someone who is choosing. And that difference is powerful. People are naturally drawn to those who are grounded in themselves, not because they're trying to impress, but because they're not trying to. There's a calmness, a confidence, a sense of direction that doesn't rely on external approval. And that kind of presence stands out in a world where so many people are seeking attention instead of building themselves. When your life is full, your energy becomes selective. You're not available for everything, not interested in everything, not responsive to everything. And that selectiveness adds value to your presence. Because now, your attention is not something that's always given. It's something that's felt when it's there. And that's where real attraction begins. Not from effort, not from trying to hold someone's attention, but from living in a way that naturally draws it. Because when you're fully engaged in your own life, you stop being someone who waits to be noticed. Become someone who is noticed without trying. And the moment your focus returns to your own life is the moment you become naturally unforgettable. And this is the point where everything either clicks or it doesn't. Because if your goal is still just to make him come back, then you haven't really shifted. You've just changed your approach, not your mindset. And as long as the focus remains on him, his return, his attention, his reaction, you're still giving away your power. It may look different on the outside, but internally, nothing has truly changed. Because real power is not about controlling someone else's behavior. It's about no longer needing to. When you reach that place, something important happens. You stop measuring your value by whether he reaches out. You stop analyzing every message, every delay, every change in tone. You stop waiting for signs because you're no longer dependent on them. Your focus moves from what is he doing to what am I choosing? And that shift is everything. Because when you're no longer emotionally tied to the outcome, your actions become clearer. You don't respond out of fear of losing him. You don't overthink your words. You don't adjust your behavior just to maintain the connection. You simply act in alignment with what feels right for you, regardless of how it's received. And ironically, that's when your presence becomes the most powerful, because now you're not trying to hold on to something. You're allowing it to either meet you or fall away. You're not chasing, not proving, not convincing. You're standing still in your own value and letting everything else reveal itself. This is why the idea of he will come back becomes almost irrelevant at this stage, because if he does come back, it's no longer the win you once thought it was. It's just information. It shows you whether he's capable of meeting the standard you've set, or if he's still operating the same way as before. And if he doesn't come back, that's information too. It tells you that the connection wasn't aligned with what you truly needed. Either way, you're not losing, because your focus is no longer on the outcome. It's on your alignment, and that's what creates real freedom. The freedom to choose without pressure. The freedom to walk away without hesitation. The freedom to engage without fear of losing control. Because you're not relying on someone else to validate your worth. You've already established it within yourself. And here's the part most people don't expect. When you truly reach this level of detachment and self-respect, when your energy is no longer chasing or waiting, that's often when people feel it the most. Not because you're trying to pull them back, but because your absence, your presence, your energy, it all carries a different weight. But by then, it doesn't define you, because you've already found what you were looking for, not in them, but in yourself. And the moment his return stops, being the goal is the moment you finally step into your real power.